under the status quo, it is common for people that perpetuate life-alteringly harmful actions on a daily basis to go unpunished for their entire life. People like police officers and prosecutors that on a day-to-day basis ensure that different people every single day are locked up potentially for decades, literally ruining their life over victimless crimes in many countries. Bosses that underpay their employees or exploit them, commit wage theft beyond all collective theft combined to the detriment of people that struggle to feed their families or get evicted. Things like, for example, CEOs choosing to use slave labor to the detriment of slaves, obviously, or the massive amount of sexual assault and spousal abuse that in many countries is legal in Russia, for example, or just never prosecuted, that completely damages a person's ability to have a fulfilling life in many aspects, or dramatically decreases someone's quality of life. These are things that are unpunished that we are very proud to start giving people just desserts for. So, briefly on the model, I think this is relatively self-explanatory. I think obviously there are varying views of morality. We will just generally say that if you do actions that make other people's lives dramatically worse, we will make your life worse in proportion. If the percentage is small, let's say 5% of people, so it's still significant but not that big. I think this is no one really knows what the cause is, but people are still able to observe trends, which we'll talk about later in the case. Are there any questions? Perfect. First constructive argument is about reforming action. So this happens through 3 key mechanisms, and the second will be a principle. So the first action is direct interference. If you, as your job, are imprisoning people every day, or other life-alteringly bad actions, as we discussed, it is likely that the punishment is going to be debilitating in a way that prevents you from furthering those harms onto other people. I.e., if a CEO gets cancer and dies because they perpetuated shitloads of slavery in their supply lines, it is very unlikely they'll be able to continue to make those same decisions because they will be having to retire because of receiving chemotherapy, or they're dead, whatever. Likewise, so even if you're just generically suffering in some way that we don't really know, it is just generally true that the act of being in tremendous pain or discomfort or whatever limits your ability to work full days and generally do actions, and probably means that you're not able to continue doing those things. The impact here is massive, right? Preventing forms of abuse that are life-altering to people, even at a 5% level, is making a massive difference to millions of people around the world that are in horrible positions. I think if we want to get marginal benefits here, the fact that these people have not morally wronged in any way, that they did not choose to be in these positions, whereas the people that are perpetuating this abuse actively choose to do it to them, means that these are vulnerable actors that deserve to be protected. And the magnitude of impact here is massive. Second reason why we reform people's actions is about learning. So often people that perpetuate these acts are unempathetic people that have never suffered in proportionate ways, i.e., rich CEOs that have never struggled financially in their life are much more comfortable perpetuating wage theft because they have never suffered financial consequences. They do not know what it's like to, for example, live from paycheck to paycheck. To the extent that we force them to undergo proportionate hardship that may or may not be comparable to that, they're more likely to have sympathy for people undergoing hardship generically, i.e., it could be something financial, they lose all their money due to some freak accident and now are forced to reckon with what poverty is like and are therefore more likely to reconsider the nature of their actions. Or even if it's some other hardship, they just have to deal with horrible disease or something like that. I think they're more likely to have a degree of sympathy from no longer having the same degree of privilege that they were attacked to. They're more likely to criticize their own forms of action. I would say that although this is not a perfect mechanism in all cases, and we won't say that everyone is going to magically have an epiphany moment, even if this happens in a small fraction of cases, the magnitude of harm that we stand for on our side, that we can prevent in some instances, is enough for us to win this round. Note that this is often, because there are no structural mechanisms to punish people under the status quo, because a lot of things are not only not punished or illegal, but actively rewarded under things like capitalism. This is the only mechanism that exists for solvency in this case. So yeah. Third thing, first let's take PLI. Yeah.
We're really happy that OG is socialist, but capitalism isn't inherently immoral. So did the aliens choose a definition of morality, or is it society dependent?
Yeah, so I don't think that it is a socialist view that if you perpetuate slavery or steal wages from laborers, that that's immoral. I actually don't think anything that I've said in my speech so far is socialist. If you think that these things are socialist, and you're kind of telling on yourself. I don't know. In terms of correlation, I think that although you can never attribute any of these things to the actions themselves, people will still likely see net patterns that will stop them from doing bad behaviors. I.e., if shitloads of cops start dropping dead because 40% of them beat their wives and the rest regularly ruin lives in other ways by terrorizing communities, I think the fact that the death rate amongst police officers is now much higher is something that people will then notice and the job becomes way less appealing to people. People might have no idea why. They might be like, maybe there's some carcinogen that these people are exposed to regularly. We don't really know. But that type of position, because there's now like lots of news stories about these people like having freak accidents happen to them and stuff like that, is still something that people will on net notice and therefore be less likely to do. It means that positions enabling structural abuse, like CEOs, your frat leaders that are like regularly like enabling or perpetrating hazing, assault, etc. Police officers, prosecutors, like these like positions within society are going to like get a degree of stigma around them just by people correlating these very negative actions happening to these people on that point.
How do you think the average religious person interprets this?
I don't know, man. Maybe they're like, it's God punishing them. I think that's even better, like to the extent that they like now tie these things to direct morality that is in some way objective, i.e. these people are actually like having bad things happening to them. I think that's good. I think probably because it's impossible to make any sort of concrete link to in a specific case. So like, you can't be like one person that got cancer is unethical, like because it's only happening at the 5% level. Most cases of cancer are still probably going to be caused by like mutations or whatever that have to do with this. I don't think any individual instance will matter, but I think when people are looking at overall like structural like roles, like being a cop, it will influence their decision to go into that position and then perpetuate abuse within that position. And so I think like the structural likelihood that people enter positions and are able to do this to others is less. Finally, on a principle, we think there's a principal preference for fairness in the absence of any other change, which is something that we value regardless of knowing if like the punishment is linked or anything like that, or having like proof. So the vast majority of people believe in some type of divine fairness, like heaven or hell or reincarnation or karma, right? Even for those who don't, they often like hope for it generically, right? You hope your high school bully will feel some sort of pain that you didn't relate in a comparable way. And even if you never find out, we argue that the values of meritocracy and justice are a better way for a world to be structured, where immoral people on some level experience the things they've done to others, and based on the fact that it's something people intrinsically value, I think this would be a good thing. But moreover, in a practical way, the sense of fairness is something that is felt and seen, at which point, when you see that your boss that was structurally abusing you for years gets hit by a bus, you probably feel better on some level. And that like relief emotionally is something that we probably value to a large extent for victims that did nothing wrong. I think just on that alone, we win this round. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Leader of the opposition, when you're ready.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I want to start by noting just how much opening government overcame their impacts. The info slide says this is a randomly, accurately identified small percentage of people. It's randomly identified. So as much as Jacob hates, police officers who do perpetuate these things, and they are obviously quite bad, the problem with this, all of this is that given the amount of immorality that exists in the world, and how broad any sort of immoral action could be, it could be anything from, me stealing something from Zarina, for example, and then that counting as immoral and not being punished, to the extent of these sort of constant crimes that opening government identified, it's incredibly unlikely, even if it's only 5% of these actions, which is still somewhat big percentage, but whatever, even if it's only 5%, you're going to actually identify the sorts of people that opening government describe. So to say that this is going to massively affect CEOs or whatever is incredibly unlikely. I think in the best case scenario, it only affects a very small number and probably isn't going to set the sort of signal that opening government describe. I think that takes out the vast majority of the case already. A few things then in this speech. I'm going to talk about like the grounds of justice and how how that actually works. Why I think it's only justified when you enable things like rehabilitation or safety for society as a whole, and why that's not going to be satisfied. That's also going to respond to the bunch of the not rehab, but like prevention kind of points coming from opening government. Before that though, I just want to have one note on like proportionality, because I'm not exactly sure how this is actually going to work, right? The impact of crimes that you do really depends. It depends on who you're hurting. The impact on you of these punishments also really depends depending on the contextual scenario of like that you existed, right? And this is exactly the problem that Zarina identifies in her POI, which is that it's really unclear what this immorality is or how these like aliens go about justifying this. If they do it themselves or if they do it based on some sort of contextual measure in the society. I think that's a really important question for opening government to be able to answer and to be able to explain how these punishments necessarily work in order for them to access all their benefits about like retribution and so on that would occur. Alright, on to the substantive case then. What do we think are the grounds of justice? I want to note that a punishment and punishing people in general is obviously a massive harm unto them. Like you're, restricting them in many ways. You're, I guess, in this motion, like subjecting them to horrific acts of fate, for example, like randomly getting cancer. I think is the example we get from opening government. This obviously causes massive distress to them, but I would also note it has an externality, right? Because it presumably also harms innocent people who exist around them in terms of their families and so on, who aren't really responsible in the same way. What are the only instances in which we justify this? I think it goes beyond just retribution, eye for an eye. We also need to have, redress to the victims, for example, for them to be aware of the harms that have happened. We need to redo it, to protect society as a whole and prevent future victims from occurring by, locking people up, etc. I think that this is obviously necessary. You need more than just retribution, because you're also hurting people who, are generally more innocent by punishing someone, and that's something that's worth considering. Before I go on to explain why, why safety doesn't happen, I'm going to take POI from closing. Yeah.
So given that all these actions go unpunished, as given in the info slide, how is it that in your world you're going to achieve all these things that you talked about?
Yeah, but the point is that I'm going to explain why it actually gets worse on your side. So that's going to kind of deal with that POI. Okay. Yeah. So how do you think retribution should work in the ideal case? I think the way it works is retribution needs to come from the person who is wrong to some extent, and that could also be the state. If I punch Zarina, for example, that doesn't then justify Jacob coming up to me and punching me in the face randomly as a result, right? All it justifies is maybe some sort of action from her in order to make redress from those crimes. And also, I would note, that's why it's also justified for the state to punish people, right? Because insofar as you're committing an immoral action or some sort of criminal action or whatever, that's also not just a harm unto the individual itself, you're also breaching their social contract in which you live and so on, and therefore harming the state as a whole and the rule of law that exists. That's why only the state, only these victims are actually justified in punishing you, and it's not why some random aliens can come in and just inflict this act of fate upon you, which ends up massively harming you as a result. So given that, then it's incredibly unjust for you to be able to do this. I'm now going to deal with the stuff that opening governments say about rehabilitation and how that happens. So what opening governments say is basically when this happens to you as an individual, you realize the harm, you kind of are massively harmed as a result, and you're removed from being able to perpetrate further abuse. I think there are a few different things I would note. Firstly, I would note already this is an incredibly small impact in the way that I've described, and this is mainly, I think, a principal debate. But also, I actually think that you're probably more likely to try and perpetrate crimes at the point at which this happens, or more likely to double down. Why is this the case? Because insofar as you just think that this is, you make no connection in your head to the crime, you have no idea of what you've actually done that's wrong. If anything, people have a tendency to justify their own actions themselves. So all they'll think, really, is that the world has turned against them and that this thing that's happened to them is deeply unfair. I don't think that's a condition that will lead to these people massively preventing or stopping the actions that we previously thought were bad. I think, if anything, that's more likely to be able to make them double down and be less willing to kind of adapt or change their actions depending on how they acted before.
If you've had a direct experience with poverty or homelessness and know what that is like on a human level, the odds that you're willing to do that to another person in the future as a boss, employer, CEO, etc., is minuscule compared to someone that can distance themselves from that, has never experienced it.
No, but that's exactly the whole point, right? Is that you still probably don't even look back on your actions as being wrong for the reasons I've described, because there's no connection to the crime or the immoral action that you've done. You literally have no awareness of why that's actually bad or not. It's not even tied directly, but as the motion describes. What then ends up happening as a result? I don't think that actually any sort of rehabilitation or kind of victim safety really occurs, because all you're doing is punishing a very small percentage of people who have no idea why they're even being punished in the first place, and you're just kind of inflicting massive amounts of harm onto them. I don't think this really sets the sort of signal that opening government want to say either, right? Because, again, as I said before, it's probably unlikely to change massive norms in policing. At best, it affects a few police officers, and you'll just think, wow, these individuals are really unlucky. It's unclear how this actually works. Given that, then, all you're doing is just hurting people and inflicting a massive cost on them, and also the people who exist around them. I think that's massively harmful, because that means that you're punishing these people in a really negative way, and it's not really even linked to the crime in any kind of meaningful sense. What then do we say at the end of this, and how this debate works? I think this debate is very simple. It's very clearly about niche principles about whether we think that retribution alone is enough to justify punishing someone and inflicting these harms upon them and the people around them. We say that it quite clearly isn't, because you're not actually preventing future victims from recurring. You're just inflicting a massive unnecessary pain upon these people, and that's something that we think is incredibly harmful. Very proud to stand opening opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, so I feel like this debate is not intended to be a debate about what percentage is small enough. I also don't think it's supposed to be a debate about what punishment is the exact type of way that you accurately, proportionately address the type of immoral actions that people are doing. I think this is a debate about the idea of whether it is something that we would prefer in a world in which people are punished for things that otherwise they would not be punished for, that we all agree are immoral. I think Jacob made it very clear in the model, this is not about aliens picking a random thing that they decide is immoral. This is about a general sense of immorality that everyone in this room would agree on. If there's an example you think does not count as that, then that doesn't have to be what it is. I think this should not be grounded in kind of that minutia. So I'm basically just going to do a lot of refutation rebuilding. But first, let's kind of talk about the op case and what we get from them. So first they talk about how this is a small percentage, 5% is still big, maybe it's 1%, and you can't identify those types of people. I just want to intuition pump this for a second, because I think that if people started realizing that 1% of cops were being debilitatedly injured in random freak accidents, they would still be worried about becoming cops, right? I think if they realize that, for example, if I offer you a jar of gum and I tell you one of these is poison, you're probably like, I probably don't want to take the poison gum, right? We think even if the percentage is small, if it's something that's markedly happening or across the world in specific ways, people are still more likely to be fearful or reticent of entering those things. I think that still stands. Secondly, they tell us it's unclear how this punishment works. I think Jacob gives you a lot of examples of the types of things it would do. We accept that it would be random enough that you wouldn't link it to that action, so it probably can't just actually be an eye for an eye, but we think it would be proportionate in the way in which it harms you, and the way in which it kind of ruins your life. Next, they talk to you about how this isn't just because this isn't the way that we view retribution. We need to lock people up and put them in prison or whatever it is, and only victims of the state can do this. A few responses. First of all, given that these are people who otherwise would not be punished, we would say that in a world in which these people cannot be locked up, in a world in which there's no other way to get those people to feel the type of pain or the type of retribution that they want to see, this is a better alternative. In the same way that if you live in an autocratic state where nobody is helping your community fight the abusers in your system, we think it is morally justified for people in that state to take that action into their own hands, especially if we know that it has a 100% accuracy rate. We would tell you that's something that we support and we believe everyone should support. In terms of it only being victims where the state can act, because we have a social contract, most people do not choose where they live and have no meaningful way to escape where they live. Some people literally live in autocracies where they couldn't live even if they happen to have the financial capacities to. We would say the Star Chamber is pretty similar to that then, except they have, again, a 100% accuracy rate. Even if they're just punishing 1% of people, we say that's way more fair than the autocratic society that's probably punished people unfairly and protected people who deserve to be punished. So that definitely falls. Now let's do some rebuilding of the case, but first I'll take a POI.
What is morality and who determines what it is?
Okay, so morality, we would say that in general we're talking about things that everybody in this room would agree are immoral. So things that tend to, across communities and across groups, be things that are actively detrimental to people's societies in ways that have nothing to do with their abilities, their capacities, and their way to exist. So for example, we would say principles such as murdering somebody unjustly are things everyone in this room would agree are very harmful. Things like enslaving people are things that everybody would generally agree are harmful. If this wants to be a debate about the specificities of what we would choose, pick the top 3 ones that everyone agrees on. Those can be the immoral action that we randomly pick about. I just don't think that would be a very interesting debate to have. Okay, so let's talk about rebuilding that. What does Jacob tell you? First of all, I think the model is very clear, right? What we are talking about are things that would generally be accepted as immoral in society. It's not like the aliens who decide or whatever it is. First, he talks about direct interference, right? I think this point is, cannot be emphasized enough. we are actively preventing people from continuing those actions, even if they never associate those actions with the immoral actions they did. Why is that the case? A lot of immoral actions people commit tend to be repetitive, right? So for example, if you're a domestic abuser, you tend to do that repeatedly over time in a way that prevents your wife or husband from ever being able to interact with society in a meaningful way, that destroys her life and her relationship with her children and her family, right? So if you are punished in a way that is severe, which it is, it actively and physically prevents you from perpetuating that harm in a lot of ways. One, if you are in enough pain that you physically cannot do the physical actions that would harm that person. If you are in bed for 12 hours a day because you don't have the energy to get up, it's easier for that person to leave their house, easier for that person to interact with other members of the community. If you're in the hospital for 6 months, she can develop an escape plan. These are very tangible ways in which, regardless of whether anyone realizes the connection, at all in any kind of statistical way, we win on that alone. Now, scale that up to other things. Recognize, even if it's 1%, 0.5%, 0.01% of CEOs perpetuating slavery, who now are unable to do that thing, who create the downfall of a corporation because they get into freak actions in which everyone, the entire chain of command is disrupted and people can, for example, flee their institutions. In conditions where, for example, a prosecutor is out of the job, and in a lot of countries then, they go overtime on their case, and those people are freed because it took them too long to get a trial. These are tangible ways in which people's lives are improved. In terms of learning, this does not require them ever associating it with what happened to them, right? We know that people tend to be more empathetic when they have experienced any type of suffering. In the same way that a lot of, for example, oppressed people have developed coalitions with other oppressed people to fight injustice, right? BLM and pro-Palestinian organizations have teamed up, right? That doesn't mean it happens all of the time, but those people, this is the only way they can learn. We know that they will otherwise be unpunished, which means this is the only tactic of rehabilitation and victim satisfaction that we have, and I think that's really important to emphasize, right? Because even if 1% of those people are rehabilitated, if one CEO goes, oh wow, I had to experience this life-altering thing, it has given me empathy, that's an entire company that might change its practices, that might improve, for example, its climate change policy, because that person's now a more empathetic person. The scope of those impacts are humongous, and I think victims still get satisfied those people were punished, even if they don't associate with the crime. Even though, that being said, we still think they probably realize on a mass scale and stop becoming cops. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and now for the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. It wasn't a silver bullet for the government teams to say that on the comparative, these crimes wouldn't be punished. Because what we told you in opening opposition was that the method that they wanted to use, this supernatural entity, wasn't punishment, it was assault. Because it didn't reach the crucial test of what justice is. And therefore, in its absence of meeting those tests, it was merely individuals having harm done onto them without the justifications which we use to form our conception of justice, not just our structural justice system. Opening government didn't meet the burden of proving that this was punishment, and therefore they cannot win this debate. I'm going to do 2 things in this speech. The first thing I want to do is talk very thoroughly about opening government's mechanisms, about how they limit harmful actions. The second thing I'm going to do in this speech is talk about proportionality and the nature of punishment and why they don't meet the test of solving all of the issues that they wanted to. If I am able to prove to you at the end of this debate that the harmful actions that they wanted to limit are severely mitigated, or at least not as big as they claim them to be, and also that the nature of proportionality in this debate is so subjective that they also have immoral actions that they themselves have to concede on their side of the house, we win this debate because it is it's not justified. So let's start. The first thing that they say, the first thing I want to do is assume that opening government are entirely correct. Even in that case, there are two major problems with their case. The first is that those in the highest positions of power that they wanted to talk about, who are the most able to perpetuate harm and immorality in society, have the greatest capacity to mitigate the harms inflicted upon them. So for example, back paying for Jeff Bezos is entirely different to back paying for an Amazon worker, and there is not a level of proportionality accrued there. That means there is a moral dilemma for opening government, because either they are going to punish Jeff Bezos in some subjectively magnitudinal way, which allows him to feel the pain of 1 million Amazon workers, in which case you're going to kill him for running Amazon, which seems immoral in and of itself, or you're just going to have him suffer from back pain. Even if this is just mitigation, I think it demonstrates that the extent to which they are able to get the empathy that they wanted to identify is severely limited. Secondly, however, opening government's case is hugely contingent on quibbles about the number of people who get punished. Kiana gets up and says, well, we don't want to have this conversation. That's not what this debate is about. But unfortunately, the case that has been constructed, it requires this analysis. Because, for example, when you talk about trend analysis, that is entirely contingent on there being a noticeable anomaly. Especially when their example is police officers who already have really high mortality and injury rates. They have to be significantly high enough that this is the tipping point to dissuade people when things like nationalism, patriotism, all of these various things, like just controlling personalities, make people want to become police officers. But even in their edge cases, even when they actually do get benefits, like the things like CEOs or like domestic abusers, I think there are reasons to believe that people's actions aren't going to meaningfully change. And that's for two reasons. The first is there is a subset of cases that opening government are talking about where this is just systematic immorality, if we accept its morality. So immorality. So when you talk about people like CEOs, that CEO is likely to get replaced by somebody who is able to then further perpetuate that action with no qualms, because they are power hungry, because they are risk takers, because they're a conveyor belt of individuals. And a marginally higher rate of death for CEOs who already die from things like coke isn't exactly going to change that. But secondly, people's actions don't meaningfully change because often people who do bad things are replicating bad behaviors in the first place. Often the person who is a domestic abuser saw domestic abuse and saw struggle in their life before. Often the person who is the cruelest CEO is the person who started poor and therefore says, fuck the world, I can just get my money. So often the people who do the most immoral things are doing so because they are externalizing the trauma that they faced in the first place. I want to note how significant this is for opening government's case, because it means that these people who do the worst things are the most likely to have already suffered, and therefore their mechanism of making them suffer, completely disconnected from the action that they took, is unlikely to get the solvency that they wanted to identify. In the absence of proving that people's actions meaningfully change, they do not meet our test, which they conceive are necessary for punishment to exist. Therefore, they're just assaulting people. Therefore, it's wrong. Before I talk about proportionality,
If under your world you can conceptualize proportionality and morality in your own justice system, why can't that same fiat apply to us?
No, it's not about fiating what our conception of justice is. We are saying we cannot impose a conception of justice. That is for the victims to do, and that is abrogated in society by justice systems. And here is where we accept that some actions will not get redressed on our side of the house. But the reason that it is important that we still maintain that imperfect system is because we have collective agreements in different subjective understandings of morality which are able to resolve themselves through justice systems, as opposed to them who still haven't been able to answer the question of what immorality looks like, because they can't just say it's stuff that we all agree is immoral. What I think is immoral is very different to what you think is immoral, it's very different to what the people of Qatar think is immoral. And this is why we ask them what they would actually be punishing and how these aliens would decide these things. I'm going to go on to explain what the implication of that for the way up of the debate is, but before that, OG.
So if you're saying that suffering can make good people bad, or you believe on some level maybe empathy could make bad people good, the fact that we're only punishing people that are already doing bad actions means they probably can't get worse, but could get better, which means there's an asymmetry. That means even if you think both things are plausible, our mechanism beats yours.
No, it doesn't, because I've just proven that if they suffered in the first place, they became worse people, they suffer again and have no correlation, you have no impact. That was not a good weighing. In terms of proportionality, I think the subjective nature of proportionality matters for 6 reasons. Firstly, because I think that these aliens are likely to have full control over the identification and punishment of this process. Secondly, the secrecy of operations means there's no accountability onto this supernatural entity. Thirdly, the genuine subjectivity of what is or isn't morality means that the actor in this debate has to be assumed to be the one making that decision. Fourthly, the nebulous justification for balancing the universe isn't a sufficient justification for committing that harm in the first place. So they are the ones who have to make that justification for themselves. But fifthly, and most importantly, because immorality is contextual, because immorality is contextual, either it is the relative societies who these supernatural forces are allowing to feel their sense of immorality or to redress their sense of immorality, or it's the aliens making that decision. If it is the aliens making that decision, then in those contexts, victims are not proximate to the crime. Victims might not necessarily have the same moral compass as these aliens, and therefore they are not getting redressed. At least on our side of the house, they would be able to do things like see their abuser, and be able to talk about their trauma. On their side of the house, somebody takes a vigilante action in their name, with which they don't necessarily agree. If it is the context of the society in which that immorality is considered to be bad, there are a whole host of things that we think are abhorrent, which are likely to be punished on their side of the house. That means, in the way up of this debate, redress for immorality is not a good in and of itself, which is why we have to have contextual test of what morality is, dependent on societies. The justice system is imperfect because it resolves those things, and they don't. We win this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Non-member government.
Panel, three things in extension. First, I'll deal with some deadlock in the opening exchange. Second, a justification as to why is it that the Star Chamber is one that is needed to reach both equity and justice, dealing a lot substantive from opening opposition and the POIs from closing opposition. And third, how do we socially engineer action on individuals? A question both by opening opposition, something closing government will answer exclusively. First, deadlocks. There are two things that side opening opposition and also closing opposition raised in this debate. First, the concept of morality, second, proportionality. First, on the issue of morality. Look, the biggest question is who's going to decide what immorality is? Is it going to be the alien? Is it going to be my mom? Is it going to be your mom? Who is it going to be? So I think just to get this out of the debate, immorality may be something that's subjective, sure, fine. But the impacts of an immoral action are objective as far. So these are things like harming other individuals, mentally or physically. So these are objective things that you can see that harm another individual. We think this is as close as objectivity as it can get. But second, the issue of proportionality. How are we going to know it's proportionate? That's also subjective. No, it's not. It can be on all fronts or some fronts. It can be the impacts of your actions, either physically or mentally towards another individual. All of these can be things that exist. My POI towards them. If in your concept of justice system, you already have a value of what is it that's moral and immoral, proportional, not proportionate, why can't we have the same? But even if you don't believe any of those explanations, panel, this is a this house prefers debate. We're talking about something that's make-believe. Give us some fiat, some reasonability for it to be charitable for a debate to even happen. That's the only way we can debate on the merits of it. I don't think this is sufficient response for their side. And which is why we think this is a deadlock that's first analysed and resolved by side closing government. Second, let's go on to the justification. Look, the first level of justification is how legal mechanisms in status quo are insufficient. There are two things here. First is the grey areas that side opening government talked about. These are immoral actions. You're being rude, treating another person a lot lower, a microaggression. But there's also a second area that also goes unpunished. There are a lot of loopholes in the existing legal system that makes inequality in terms of punishment. You think about rich, privileged people, people who have a lot of money, people who can bribe politicians, people who can bribe prosecutors, that get away with a lot of crimes that exist. And these are in your own objective standards that side opening bench wants to talk about. These are the things that exist. The only attack that comes from the entirety of their side is that you don't know you're being punished, so rehabilitation doesn't happen. For the second part of it, this is a problem that exists on their side. I don't know how they fix it. But second, let's weigh out retribution and rehabilitation. Is rehabilitation truly the apex of the limbs of the justice system? Because we say no. Even in status quo, you have capital punishment, be it death penalty or also life in prison, which don't care about rehabilitation as the limb, but focus more on retribution and deterrence. Because the apex of limbs of the justice system is always first to prevent crimes and make sure that these crimes go punished, even to the extent of rehabilitation. This deals with the principal argumentation that came out of opening opposition, that you must know why you're being punished for, or there must be some element of rehabilitation. That's not true, because it's not even in status quo. That's just to rebut their characterization, right? But next, even if you think that rehabilitation is so important, you know what is more important, panel? The fact that victims exist in their world. Victims that don't get any redress, that there's no justice that's being done, no equity being done. We think it's more important that we prioritize these victims because there's the act that's being done. But even if, right, we think we extend on the idea from opening by explaining why is it that through the star chamber, if something happens to you, it'll be something that's proportionate. Meaning to say, if you treat your mate like shit, perhaps at work your boss will treat you like shit. So you have first-hand experience of how being treated like shit looks like, which is why you're more likely to reform, or at least think about it when you talk to your mate in a rude manner. Which is why we think this can impact the actions of individuals. But why is it that this star chamber thing is completely good? Because first, it's apolitical. There is no involvement of any politics, intangible. Any privileged individuals can't have control over this alien or whatever this technology is in terms of it, so they can't escape it. But second, all of these grey areas that already exist. The cornerstone of justice system is not just rehabilitation, but ensuring that equity and justice is reached. And this is something that can never be achieved on their side in both the grey areas and also the objective areas that people run away from. So we think the justice system of our world has to be malleable. It can't be as immalleable as saying, bro, there's no rehabilitation. Bro, people are being affected. That's more important than whatever rehabilitation that you want to talk about. Yes?
The problem with punishing people based on impacts is it means that two of the exact same action can be punished differently depending on who you're doing the action to, and that's unfair, as you said.
Okay, fine. But think about it. These are, like for everything else that has got some objectivity and people be punished by the legal mechanisms that are objective, those are out of the debate. We're talking about all the other areas that already exist. In your world, these things get undetected and unpunished at all. That is the comparative that their side has to deal with. Because like even if it's not as proportional, even if it's not as systematic, even the justice system is fluid enough to give you different punishment for different actions. It's not all the same. These are things that already exist in your own paradigm of the justice system. Let's go on to the next argument. How do we socially engineer individuals and their actions? There are two levels to this. First, so the concept of this, people keep questioning like what is this alien and etc. And there's a question from closing, that is this the same as religion? How will it conflict individuals? The belief in a higher being or higher ideal is something that has already existed in status quo. This is not something that's just exclusive to religion that religious people hold on to, but even agnostics and atheists, there is always something higher that will check and balance in the world. I think opening drop karma. Let me explain to you what karma is from a Hinduist perspective, right? This is not that Boy George song, right? But this is rather the Alicia Keys and Justin Timberlake song. What goes around comes around. About how is it that the karmic balance exists in the world, that when you do good, you get repaid with good, and you do bad, you get repaid by bad. These are ideas that have already existed in status quo, ingrained into children. Look, this is where we extend on this further. This is a this house prefers debate. So it's a reimagined world. So it's not just we teach kids karma, we tell them, bro, this star chamber is karma on steroids. It's not just that it'll come at you, it will come at you surely, because this is something that is accurately come at you. So even in their case, there is only a small percentage, maybe 2% of, oh, that's not even closing. If only 2% of individuals are being punished, it doesn't matter. It's a socially engineered thing that is ingrained into people. We will teach kids, we'll tell them in schools that this is something that not only exists but will come at you for surely. Meaning to say, if they think that, well, people will think they get away with it. No, it's not just the fear of the unknown, but the fear of the unknown that it could come at you. This will deter any CEOs, any person that's exploiting individuals that they think they get away, any privileged person that think they can bribe away their way out of trouble. They will all get involved in this. This is how you engineer the actions of individuals. Because now they don't have to weigh out the crime. If I'm going to commit this immoral act or a crime, will I get punished or not by the normal justice system? Because this is something they can't control. It's outside the means. Which is why you do socially engineer people to change their actions. And this is something that would exist only on our side, not on their side with whatever existing mechanisms that happen. The difference with karma in status quo and this version of karma or star chamber, it is guaranteed, it is something that will happen, and it's also something that may be random but is accurate and is also proportionate. Panel, I think in this debate, fine, this star chamber may not be the best thing that exists in status quo, it may not be the most accountable, but status quo is fun. This is something that can make status quo better. Proud to propose.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. No member opposition.
Consequences matter most in this debate. This is for 3 reasons. The first is because OO's response to OG's principle in its strongest form is reliant on the idea that there is a consequential harm generated to the individual who is punished, but no consequential benefit generated to other individuals who are being harmed. I think this is a charitable interpretation of OO, and I think this is the way that OO would beat OG. This therefore means that all op impacts are reliant on that consequential impact, aka proving that you in fact impact people who are being harmed by policy. Second, consequences matter because preventing immorality is prior to rectifying immorality. The way that we know this is because rather than having a crime happen and then punishing it, we would rather that the crime did not happen in the very first place. Therefore, we know that crime itself is prior to the rectification or justified rectification of crime. The third thing is that this is already instituted in our justice systems and recognized by wide society. That is why, for instance, we have things like plea deals or contracts with individuals who provide information on other individuals who commit crimes. We allow individuals to say, look, if you just give us information, we will give you lesser punishments. Why? Because we think it will prevent more crime and more harm in the future. We think it's important to protect more people from that nasty impact. So, what do we therefore prove in this speech? I think I'm going to prove 3 things. The first is I'm going to show that their principle does not stand on its own grounds, that the punishment itself creates harm toward innocent individuals and therefore is illegitimate but also consequentially harmful. Secondly, I'm going to show that the reaction of this creates huge harm. Third, if I have some time, I'll discuss the principle in pure form as well. Firstly, I do think that this creates huge harms toward individuals. I just think that wrong order. I'm going to first talk about the reaction. The reaction itself is very bad. First form that I'll talk about is, well, the dying CEO. I just think that the dying CEO is a perfect example of why their case is wrong. The CEO is not an individual that is evil. They are part of a system that is evil. So yes, we will make the socialist argument, which is actually the claim that CEOs are part of a system of shareholders, of boards of trustees, of funders, and individuals who expect you to use the cheapest possible supply chain. And when that CEO dies, they're just replaced by another singular person because of all of these structural factors that lead that CEO to be the person who was appointed in the very first place. There are tens and hundreds of people who are desperate to get that spot at the top of the company. And so they would enact the exact same decisions. And I don't think that they would change these things in many cases because supply lines are sticky, because you don't want to make a radical change and come in and be seen as the woke CEO who immediately decrease profit. The short-term incentives of that individual are likely affected. So a recognition that evil is in many cases systemic does not necessarily absolve those individuals of guilt, but does mean that they don't decrease harm. The other thing to point out is that we flip this argument, because the optics of trying to criticize a person who just got cancer is terrible. Look, Charles Hill is one of the worst people ever to exist. He participated directly in the Iran-Contra deal, and he was a professor at Yale. But you know what? When he died, everyone immediately said, you cannot criticize him, you cannot criticize his legacy, you can't say that what he did was bad, because that's disrespectful to someone who's facing tragedy. I think it's much more likely under their side of the house that you can't criticize those companies. So, that's harmful. B, the second thing that I'll talk about is that the empathetic capitalists under this argument. Their claim is, well, you have empathetic capitalists or police officers who learn what it's like to have harm under their side of the house. Firstly, survival mentality dominates the empathetic response. The idea that just because you have an experience or are with people who are going through a particular experience means that you care about them is absolutely wrong, for 3 reasons. 1, because often pain is a rat race, especially if it's something like financial struggle, because you feel like you're directly struggling with others in order to survive. You're struggling with someone else for a promotion, you're struggling with someone else for a job, you feel like you're competing with them just so you can stay off the street, just so you can stay comfortable. 2, because feelings of unfairness to you specifically, because you as an individual feel like you've lived well, I don't deserve to be here, as opposed to the others who do deserve to be here. Why do we know this? Because the emotion says that you don't attribute this to your own actions. You think that this is a random tragedy that befell you. 3, because you as an individual have been entitled throughout your life. You've been doing bad things for a long time, and no harmful consequence has come from it. You therefore feel that you don't have anything done wrong, and therefore you feel like you should have had a better life, and therefore are angry at other people. I think what this means is that this taints the perceptions that you have of the experience. That yes, you have the experience, but it makes you more bitter towards other people who are like you. It makes you more bitter toward the fact that you have that experience, and therefore harm other people. This leads into a huge impact, which is that people who harm others and take from others are hugely harmful under their side of the house. Why? Because the type of person who abuses their partner, the type of person who steals from others on a massive scale, is not the type of person who just back down when something bad happens to them. I think that these individuals often do these things because of a deep sense of egotism, a deep sense of insecurity. And I think that, therefore, there are 3 things that lead to them being worse under their side of the house. First, they do more bad things in order to reassert a sense of control within their lives. Secondly, they do so in order to project an idea of power or perception, the idea that I want to be the patriarch of the family, I want to reassert myself. So yes, I went through a workplace injury, but I'm going to come back and be even more abusive to my family. I think that's incredibly harmful. Third, I think more broadly, the idea that the world is cruel to you, you have a right to fight back. I think a lot of these people are deeply spiritual or deeply religious, have strong beliefs that, oh, well, I need to fight back and regain my place in the world. Okay.
So I just want you to intuition pump this. If a billionaire gets cancer, do you think they're more likely to donate a bunch of money to like cancer research because they don't care about it, or like spread carcinogens because they resent other people with cancer?
I mean, I think that they try to get the best cancer care for themselves, but I also think that that individual is highly likely to try to establish a good legacy in the company by maximizing profits within their long term. I also think that like the mundane example, the average example of the vast majority of people who are committing harm is like the average person who's going to go back and like go do worse things to their family, go perpetuate worse harms. That individual probably wants to leave a good legacy, and therefore the good legacy is them reasserting their control, reasserting their power. So I think that this leads to huge harms under their side of the house as well. Closing.
Your whole reactionary argument that people get worse because of being punished, how does that apply in status quo where people are being punished by normal means?
Yeah, they are being punished by normal means, but it's attributed directly to the thing that they did, and therefore it's much more likely that they have to do things in deterrence, or not do those things again because they know that they'll be punished by the criminal justice system, as opposed to just generally like facing a tragedy and being upset by that. I think clearly this causes harm. Also, like, you're presumably not being jailed by the Star Council, so I don't think that it creates the same prevention benefits under their side of the house. See, I think changes in perception, this beats their correlation argument. To the extent that people believe that they're like now acts of God, this firstly means that people now believe that poor people deserve to be punished as well. Secondly, it means that people are more likely to rally around. If people believe that police officers are suddenly facing like unknown spiritual harms, then they're much more likely to militarize and be much more paranoid to attack other people. I think that's a huge harm as well. Next thing that I want to talk about quickly is that they do create direct harm through their punishment, and therefore their punishment is illegitimate. Why? Because it affects other people. Now, I know that OO mentions this, but they don't explain structurally why. The reason why is because the way that you have to target this in order to make sure that the individual doesn't attribute it to their own actions is to give them some sort of intense personal loss. That is in many cases affecting a deeply cared about loved one of theirs. But also, even if it's not that, like you lose your job, your family is much more likely to fall into poverty. Your family goes through all of the harmful consequences of having a loved one that is going through a traumatic incident. I think that those individuals are affected as well, and therefore creates a huge negative impact. So even if you don't care about the perpetrator, you care about the people that they love that are in many cases innocent. For all these reasons, happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And Government Whip.
Judge, I think it's pretty telling that closing opposition does zero attempt at responding to our extension material because we were right. We were right to say that Star Chamber, despite the fact that it might only target a small percentage of individuals physically, it has a much greater sociological impact to every single person. Because we have a fiat to say that in a reimagined world where this exists, we can tell stories to individuals at a very tender age in life, and people fear things that they don't have tangible control of. And I think that's an attachment to a higher than value ideal that sticks to people's minds and creates that form of awareness and deterrence that they never want to deal with. The structure of my speech is simple. I'm going to deal with each individual house and tell you why our extensions are debate winning. First on CO, I just want to point out that none of it were new. The whole idea on socialist extension was firstly opening opposition. Secondly, on be more abusive was also opening opposition, but thematically deal that when I'm dealing with opening opposition. But let's deal with it at the meat of the argument right now. The first on the socialist extension, on how CEOs are part of a bad system, it's not actually their fault. The first is, even if it's part of the bad system, the fact that we're punishing the CEO means that we're also taking an attempt to fix that disrupted system, rather than no alternatives to address that under their world. So even if one CEO is punished as a result of being in that broken, problematic system, there is some form of rectification that happened, and there's a marginal change there. Rather than no acknowledgement of the broken system, they will let that system marginalize and cause more exploitation to more people in the worst case. But secondly, deal with our sociological impact. That it can socially engineer people to not even do those things in the first place because they fear that this might
hurt them, or they fear that this might catch them at a point in which they do this continuously. And I think this is crucial. Secondly, they explain that the individuals will be more abusive. And their analysis to this is, I need to fight more at a point in which I face this. I can't take this, I need to be more patriarchal in this sense. But who are you going to resent? Like, bro, these are aliens. Who are you resenting to? I don't understand the argumentation as to how you're going to be more abusive or more violent to something when this is probably just by virtue of fate. Or for example, when you're a victim of circumstance where you probably are facing a situation where you're probably sicker because you made fun of a sick person, how are you going to resent to a particular stakeholder when this is something that is highly arbitrary? But secondly, have a seat, I'll take you later, there's no nuance as to how exactly this is something that, there's no nuance as to how individuals will react more antagonistically. Because I think all they prove is very convenient analysis to why bad people are going to be more antagonistic, good people are now going to become bad people. We know virtue analysis to why this is the likely reaction of each stakeholder. But the final claim I want to make here that already takes out their case, that even if it's true that people are antagonistic, that's not an excuse for us to not punish them. The fact that they're reacting antagonistically is because they are wrong, and we're punishing them, we're keeping them accountable, and we're doing a net good to society. They are out. Let's deal with opening opposition. I think there are a lot of claims here. The first thing that they said was, the whole immorality is subjective. Who is going to decide immorality? Is it aliens? Is it, like, how is it going to be objective? There are 5 responses here that already take this out. I'm going to make it very clear. First is, this debate needs to be one of weighing and deal with some level of objectivity or morality. And I think it was clear with our members' speech that sometimes the immoral acts that you do have a very objective harm, and that means morality can to a large extent still be quantified in terms of objective means. Secondly, just very, very intuitively, if a star chamber directs people on a small percentage, it's very unlikely that you will deal with very, very niche instances where morality is subjective and grey area. Like, just think about it. If you're an alien and you want to deal randomly with a small percentage of immoral acts, why would you choose someone that probably is a capitalist rather than a clear-cut objective mechanisms of the individuals are wrong? So intuitively, by virtue of it being a small percentage, it likely means that it's clear-cut objective versions of immorality. But at best, let's take them at their best. If you're a capitalist, will you be punished under our will? Simple. If you purchase a Prada bag maybe, and by virtue taking them at best and still you get punished under our will, your punishment will be proportional towards buying that Prada bag. Maybe you'll get ripped off by another person. That's marginal. So taking them at their best where there's some grey area of immorality there, your punishment will also be a marginal punishment that's proportionate towards you. I think that's also fair in terms of proving why there's proportionate in line. Before that, I'll take opening.
Your karma benefits are contingent on the assertion that society will know about the supernatural power, whereas karma can already be justified by legends and examples of bad people.
Karma is exactly this narrative that we are in support of, and yes, it's contingent on people knowing that, but we are fiat to say that we can socially engineer and make individuals believe in that at the point in which this reimagined world exists. I don't think you're being comparative. But fourthly, let's just not get sucked into this debate of whether immorality or morality is subjective. Like, we're done with round 1 in the charities motion. Let's get on with it. But it's important to note here that at best, opposition bench only deals with a very small scope of this debate, because their case only works if immorality is subjective. And I just want to point out that their case is mitigatory at best and doesn't deal with a thorough scope of where this debate operates. So even if you take their premise, at least the possibility of dealing with a wide range of immoral acts means that we're more thorough and means they're more precise there. But finally, and this is the deal breaker here, our case also relies on the premise that it can be crimes that are unpunished. This breaks their deadlock because even if you don't talk about morality, immorality is really subjective. In status quo, there are crimes that are unpunished because both the higher-ups and people can reach towards pockets of society, bribe individuals, and evade punishment. The reason why this is crucial is because criminals are also within the umbrella and bandwagon of immorality, and we address that under their mechanisms of objective criminal, and we deal with that because individuals fear them much greater. I'll just get PY. Go for it.
Yeah, so what do you do then when the CEO who got cancer is now much more irritable and implements terrible policies for workers, but people can't criticize him for it? Or the police officer becomes much more abusive just because they're in a bad mood for their family?
Firstly, I don't know why they get cancer. Secondly, you know analysis to why they become more antagonistic rather than just a simplistic assertion. But thirdly, the first-hand experience and the fact that you fear unknown means that it's likely to hit you at the back, and that's enough awareness for you to not do anything. The final thing I want to note here is that let's deal with opening government and why do we extend over them. Opening government has a pretty good case, and they explain about how their reformative measures and individuals oftentimes can sympathize and check their views better. Two reasons why we edge over them, and this is crucial. The first is our magnitude of impacts are greater. We deal with this in two ways. One, our sociological impact that was mechanized much better deals with every single person, not just a small percentage that the aliens target. But secondly, is that we address crimes that are also within the bandwagon of immoral acts that we think is a much bigger claim. But second reason is that we had a principal analysis to explain the grey area where crime does not touch, and why exactly this means that we can target the most individuals in terms of the placebo effect, the way in which miracles and other forms of religious norms work. For all those reasons, vote CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now for opposition whip.
So first, to respond to CG's mechanism about karma, 3 responses here. Number 1, I think the POI was just correct. To be clear, these are narratives that already exist. Religious people and people who believe in spiritual narratives like karma tell people that karma is a thing. Their response is just that, yeah, we fiat people know this. How? The motion does not say so. It just says the star chamber exists. And to be clear, the people who think that karma is a thing genuinely believe that karma is a thing. So it's not like it's particularly symmetric between both sides of the house. But second, perhaps the biggest kicker is there is already a deterrent in the status quo, which is the criminal justice system. And yes, the criminal justice system does not catch everybody, the same way the fucking star chamber only catches like 2% of these people as well. So to the extent in which people believe there's a small chance of getting punished, that is symmetric on both sides of the house, and it's unlikely to change. Last, on like the fact that this is a small percentage, I want to do some characterization here because this is really important. I think it also responds to their argument about how people will see patterns. This is genuinely a very small amount of people. Note that there's a high degree of noise in the way that our lives go. Plenty of CEOs get cancer anyway due to completely arbitrary reasons, and that difference does not exist on both sides of the house. And perhaps more importantly, note that they say a ton of people go unpunished. Yeah, a ton of people go unpunished by the criminal justice system. It doesn't mean a ton of people go unpunished in this like cosmic karma fashion. Plenty of bad people end up getting cancer just due to the fact that most of our lives mean revert to the mean over a long period of time. So there's unlikely to be difference on their side of the house. Not now. I just want to frame the extension in a couple of ways. I think it was quite clear that consequentialism outweighs in this debate, because it was quite clear that opening opposition spent almost all their time on the principle, but their principle was path dependent on there not being a consequentialist justification for this. That is to say, their response to every question about, yeah, but this actually prevents harm, this prevents people from getting harmed, is like, oh no, but other parts of our case deal with that. They only said like 3 arguments about this, where basically 2, they said, 1, you feel anger at the world, and 2, many people feel trauma about these things, and that causes them to do crimes. I think those things were broadly assertive. What we brought to you as extension is a very detailed and actually specific mechanism for how this is likely to go down, why it's the case that people who feel this kind of cosmic karma, due to certain psychological traits, due to evolutionary biases they have in the mind, and due to the way that they're positioned within their societies, are likely to backlash to these kinds of things instead of, oh, being empathetic because the CEO now has back pain, so they understand what it is like to actually be an Amazon worker. A couple of reasons we outframe our opening here. The first is that we assume best implementation of this policy. That is to say, we don't consider the clash on proportionality, on whether this is something that can actually be implemented, on whether morality exists. We're going to assume that their model is correct, which is that murder is bad, sexual assault is bad. We tell you more of that happens on our side of the house. So I'm not going to repeat everything that Matt said, but I will frame a couple of important things in order to respond to the responses we got. So the first is this point about debilitation, and this is also what opening says. I have a couple of responses here. So the first thing is that I think the easiest way to beat this argument is that to the extent that they have to rely on this being something that people understand, that is to say they see more police officers dropping dead for various reasons, they're likely to do things that are preemptive. This is important. Even if it's the case that it's those police officers that perhaps drop dead, or we say a vast number of police officers are now empowered with greater degrees of militarization, are more protected, because we have an instinct to protect our police officers. This is the response to the US. 1% of police officers do drop dead for various reasons to respond to Jacob. And the response has been Blue Lives Matter. The response has been to have much greater levels of protection for those individuals. And I think the structural reason why this is true, besides those that Matt gave you, is that, to be clear, the cosmic karma is completely random, but us as humans find ways to ascribe meanings to these things. things. That is to say, when we have police officers and we see them dropping dead for various reasons, we're like to say, what are we doing wrong? What is society doing wrong? And the response to that is likely to be colored by the existing biases that we have, which is to say, these police officers don't have enough guns, which is to say, the communities that they work on are dangerous. Those biases pre-color the way that these responses occur, which means that we're far more likely to crack down because we want to protect them, and we want to reduce that form of violence. That's beyond all the things that Matt said as well. They say it's an assertion. Matt had 7 minutes of phenomenal material on this. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that was extension. They say being antagonistic is not a reason to punish them. I don't think that's a response here. I'll take opening.
Okay, so this derivative argument is still symmetric because you still want to punish people on your side. So if you jail someone for 10 years, they have the same reactions. Given that we both agree that we want retribution for the things we collectively agree are moral, why not incapacitate someone who harms their workers so they can continue to do it?
Okay, I'll respond to incapacitation in particular, but to the response that this is a response to the criminal justice system. All of the mechanisms we gave prove why this is only specific to this form of cosmic karma that gives you randomly cancer and doesn't put you through a criminal justice system. The example that I gave you about the police, when we run these people through the criminal justice system and they're like actually convicted, that as a society we understand these police officers did something wrong, but we see them dropping dead on the streets, we're far more likely to believe that there are environmental or circumstantial problems with that. But a couple of other things here. One, the criminal justice system links your punishment to your evil action, which causes you to actually self-reflect, to face social sanctions. All of our arguments about how you feel the world is unfair, why you're likely to reassert control, why you have an evolutionary bias towards the things that you do, those things are important. But lastly, the criminal justice system is like bad sometimes as well. We're happy to say that there's over-punitivity in the criminal justice system, and that's not a good thing, right? So this doesn't change on both sides of the house. A couple of things that I want to highlight about the extension that I think are winning. One, and a couple of ways that we distinguish over opening government, because these guys, I think, said things that there was a deadlock. One, note that you are an entitled individual, which means that your whole life you have gone unpunished. Therefore, your frame of mind is you believe you can get away with anything, so when you see that you have been punished for the first time, you're likely to see it as a deviation. You're definitely not likely to actually learn from that action. You're far more likely to lash out because of it. Matt told you that pain is a rat race. They told you that you're likely to see this unfair. Moreover, they told you you're likely to be an extraordinarily egotistic individual for the reasons I've described, and you want to reassert a sense of control. You're likely to be the patriarch in the family, and you're likely to believe that the world is cruel to you, so you want to, out of that insecurity, change that. I think we distinguish by trying far more mechanisms that actually justify this and break the deadlock. Closing.
If your response is that this mechanism is similar to just karma and status quo, can you give me one evidence of people lashing out because of karma and status quo?
I'm not actually particularly sure what that means. I mean, I think if they believe that something is cosmic karma to them, I think they're just likely to be pissed off of it for all the reasons they understand. Like, yeah, they're likely to be frustrated at the fact that the cosmic order has turned against them because they see themselves as an entitled individual who can get away with everything. So that's very, very important. A couple of other responses. On the response to what opening said about like learning and empathy. A point here is that it is very important here that the punishment is not the reverse of the crime. That is to say, if you are Jeff Bezos, you do not get punished by being subject to working in an Amazon factory. If you are a CEO, you are not destroyed by Amazon like destruction. Their example was you get cancer, or you get something else. So I think that just directly takes out their argument because you're unlikely to have empathy towards the thing that you have been doing because the punishment that you have gotten is different. But second, it means you are far more likely to be able to distance yourself from that thing. Note that you want to see yourself as a moral individual, right? So CEOs do not want to actually see the things they've been doing their whole lives as a bad thing. They're instead likely to see cancer as something that is unfair, as evidence that the world is turning against them for the reasons that we've described. But second is that even if it is the thing, I think you're far more likely to distance because of the pre-existing biases that you have. You see people who work at Amazon warehouses as lesser than. You see these as secondary individuals. When you get to work in those positions, you see that as not fit for you. Not that, oh, I suddenly understand how bad of a life this is. I just think this is extraordinarily unlikely. For all of those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.